Episode 10 is the aftermath in this point of no return. Katsura's dependency on Makoto reaches a massive breaking point. She's trapped in her own world, constantly under the belief that Makoto is just being pushed around by these other girls, and that he really only has feelings for her. But then Makoto does the unthinkable. He does what he should have done earlier on in the show. He finally breaks up with her. However, because this is already after all that's transpired, and all of the trauma that's gone on, Katsura completely loses it. Otome, on the other hand, I find to really be an enabler of Makoto's poor behavior. While she dislikes not being chosen for the dance, she's still accepting of how he acts and is okay with it purely on the basis that he's able to see her as a woman, rather than just as some childhood friend. That in spite of all the girls he's messed around with, he's still messing around with her in the gym storage room. In defense of Sekai and Setsuna, while they may not be saints, they still had felt bad for what they were doing, as well as tried to prevent Makoto from hanging around any other girls. Otome doesn't really feel that in the slightest. And while these actions may raise some red flags, this is actually quite consistent with her character, since Otome is first and foremost about pursuing her own wants and her own desires, as shown in the previous episode, what with her discussion with Taisuke. Speaking of Setsuna, she unfortunately makes the wrong choice here and pretty much succumbs to what she feared she would. Setsuna is by no means stupid. She knows that if Makoto sleeps with her, it really won't make a bit of difference, and Makoto still will sleep with girls other than Sekai. Ultimately though, Setsuna's moving to France soon, and she believes she'll never get this opportunity again. So, she sleeps with him, and thus further enables this poor behavior. Setsuna never even tells Sekai, her own best friend who she's been trying to look out for the entire series, that she's moving. And honestly, how could she? Knowing that she's just betrayed all of those principles that were so ingrained within her being from the start of the show. You can just see the look of shame in her expression as she departs on the train. The tears rolling down her eyes before heading toward the plane. She feels bad about it. These secrets that the characters try to cover up time and time again throughout the show can no longer be hidden, starting with this big bombshell. The room where Makoto and Otome were sleeping together had a hidden camera. Now, if you want my personal opinion, I actually think this plot point is a bit sloppy. First of all, the upperclassman character doesn't even play a role in the show outside of this. In fact, she doesn't even have a name in the anime. Not to mention, I feel like School Days does a fantastic job at foreshadowing future events and building up on things, but this plot point in comparison didn't have as strong of foreshadowing or as strong of build-up. It's a pretty creepy scene when it happens, but I don't think it was written into the narrative very well. And since Setsuna is unable to keep Makoto and Sekai in check, their relationship is pretty much a mess. Sekai feels like she has nobody except Makoto, and what's happening is pretty much what Setsuna said would happen. Sekai locks herself in isolation, Makoto becomes completely out of control and loses any sense of conscience, focusing only on receiving his own sexual gratifications, and it feels like nobody's really there to help. Hikari is an absolute phony, and Nanami has her own troubles since she was also featured on that same videotape in the previous episode, so she can't really help. Especially since it's never made clear, but I'm pretty sure the implication is that the person on the videotape was not her boyfriend. Even Otome, who is okay with being just another woman to Makoto, can no longer condone his actions when she realizes he won't take any responsibility for impregnating Sekai. This is actually a very important scene, because it's been established that Otome is probably the most flawed character in the entire show. But even with all of those flaws, she still has some sort of morality to her, and that morality is entirely lost on Makoto. If he calls one girl on his phone and she won't answer, to him it's just on to the next one. no regard for these people as individuals. This portion of the show taking place during Christmas Eve is actually very important, since in Japan, Christmas Eve is viewed as a holiday for couples. This is shown in many different anime and visual novels, the most notable one coming to mind being A Tale of Memories, where the two main characters, Hiro and Miyako, meet on Christmas Eve and then the two start bonding from there. In this case though, Makoto finds himself alone due to everyone else now ignoring him. This is almost an opportunity for him to think about how he screwed up, and for him to finally take responsibility for his own actions. But unfortunately, there's still one girl, other than Sekai, who's willing to accept Makoto for who he is. And that is Katsura, who now, of course, has completely lost it. Sekai was trying to look for the silver linings within this issue, believing that even with this child, even with this burden, she at least gets to be with Makoto, which is what she always wanted, as shown when she's lying down in the infirmary in episode 11. She even cooks a nice dinner for both of them at his house. But Makoto hasn't changed at all, and he brings Katsura to the house after Sekai leaves. Makoto sees the mess on the floor, and he starts to gain some self-awareness. He knows deep down that he's partially responsible for what has happened, even if he puts on the facade of not being at fault to Sekai. She sees the two on the train, she goes back, and all hell breaks loose. Sekai and Katsura kinda feel the same way toward each other. They both want to give Makoto the benefit of doubt, because to both of them now, they rely on him. So instead, they'll constantly create excuses to make him less responsible for his own actions. They'll say stuff like, "She made you do those things." When Katsura reveals what happened with Setsuna, she makes Sekai feel guilty for her own actions. Just because Makoto said it was okay doesn't mean she isn't at fault, and she realizes that, even if she's denying it. So what you end up having are these two characters, Makoto and Sekai, who know they've messed up horribly, but refuse to atone for it due to being too far gone. Instead, Makoto sticks with Katsura, because ironically, she has become the less stressful of the two to hang out with. After all, you look back to why Makoto left Katsura in the first place, it was because she was too tiring, and he had greater chemistry with Sekai. But if you look at Sekai now, she's constantly stressed out. Katsura is the comforting lie, while Sekai is the bitter truth. Now to address the elephant in the room. The show's ending. Firstly, I think the series does a great job building up to this point, and it doesn't feel like this comes out of nowhere. By having the characters constantly make the same mistakes over and over, it justifies the extreme outcome. Even without taking that into consideration, the show utilizes a lot of visual cues to hint at this ending. One of the biggest ones coming at the end of episode 7, where Sekai leaves Makoto's apartment and she sees Katsura standing outside. The way that final scene is shot is almost out of a horror movie with its use of Dutch angles and the lack of background music. All one can hear is the sound of Katsura's footsteps, slowly moving forward. It was a very simple, yet efficient way of hinting the audience of what's to come. Or how the camera zooms in at the kitchen knives in episode 10 when Katsura's cooking. Or the emphasis on the knife that Sekai is using to cut the carrots in episode 11. Or even the kettle symbolism used at the beginning of the finale, wherein Makoto tries to put the kettle out but ends up getting burned, which foreshadows the kettle going off right before he gets stabbed. What I also believe is so effective about this ending is how impactful it is. There's a reason that even 10 years later, people still talk about this ending. It leaves a lot of room for interpretation, but at the same time, one can understand why it happens without needing that room. It doesn't utilize it as a crutch. When I say this, I'm specifically referring to the big question of, was Sekai really pregnant? The show never quite makes itself clear on whether or not this is the case. I mean, Katsura says she isn't, but in the grand scheme of things, Katsura is an unreliable narrator. I definitely believe that, even if hypothetically Sekai wasn't pregnant, she at the very least thought so. The way she acted in particular at the infirmary, where she says,
でも、そっか、誠の赤ちゃん。
suggests that she's looking for silver linings, rather than just conjuring up some convoluted scheme. I think the big reason she didn't even want to go to the hospital in the first place was more so because it was Katsura who suggested it. The way the camera zooms in on her name during that scene suggests this. But regardless of how one interprets that plot point, it doesn't really take away from the finale's impact. The music, the conflict, the directing, it all speaks for itself. And the fantastic animation from veteran animator Hironori Tanaka makes it even better. But even with all I've said within these two parts, I don't think I've clearly explained why I believe this show is brilliant. A main reason is because this is a show where no singular character is really the good guy. There's always more to what's going on than at first glance. A lot of people I've talked to have said that the ending to School Days made them happy, because they got to see these characters that they despised for 12 episodes brutally murdered. But personally speaking here, I was actually very sad by the ending to this show. These characters were undoubtedly flawed individuals, but I don't believe they deserve to die. I see this ending no differently than I see a big tragedy on the news. The first big thing constantly going through my mind when rewatching School Days was, how could this have been prevented? And there were many times in the show I thought of possible solutions, many of which I've already documented within this series. But at the same time, I understood why they would make the choices they did. A majority of these choices never felt irrational for the characters that made them. I also find it comparable to a news story tragedy because a lot of times, as more information comes out, your perspective on who to side with changes. School Days is very similar in this regard. The further the show goes on, the more you realize that there's multiple perspectives to this story. Most of the show I found myself siding with Setsuna, but as it went on, I began to understand the flaws in her character and saw her differently by the end than I did at the beginning. A majority of the time, I believed that Otome was an antagonist, but when she finally told off Makoto near the end of the show, I thought a lot more highly of her. At the end of the day, you begin to realize not every single tragedy follows a simple narrative of perpetrator and victim. That kind of nuance in a show that revels itself in extremes I find to be very valuable. Another one of the big criticisms levied against the show quite often is that the girls don't really have any real reasons for liking Makoto. They say he's too bland, he doesn't have any redeeming qualities. But here's the thing, to them he does. Each girl in the series has their own individual reasons for finding him attractive. Katsura, as we already know, is a character constantly in isolation, so when a boy like Makoto is looking at her on the train all the time, she picks up on it. She really has nobody else, so of course she's going to like Makoto. In the case of Sekai, sure she has a light crush on him beforehand, but it grows and develops once they start sitting next to each other. Otome has known Makoto since childhood, so they already have a sense of familiarity that's been built up over the years. The big problem being that Makoto isn't even in the same class as her anymore. So now Otome would want Makoto, since she now realizes what she's lost. Setsuna, as we've established, is someone who looks out for Sekai, but at the expense of her own self-interests. She sees Makoto protect her from bullies and she views him as strong. There's even a scene of Makoto pushing the cart on wheels with Setsuna in the back, emphasizing Makoto's strength and how much she values it. Setsuna knows that she's caught in a bit of a rough situation, but still tries to make Sekai happy first and foremost. That is, until she has nothing left to lose, in which case she succumbs to her own desires. The other girls essentially jump on the bandwagon once they come to the conclusion that Makoto has been with all of these other girls. If all of these girls like Makoto, then to them they interpret that as a status symbol of sorts. Makoto becomes a hot commodity, so to speak. This is made evident in episode 11 during the scene where Otome's friends are talking about Makoto. Then, once it's revealed he got Sekai pregnant, they begin to all avoid him out of fear that the same will happen to them. The only character I don't think had much motivation to sleep with Makoto was Hikari, who was very much pursuing Taisuke in the show. I think the implication is that she grows fed up with Taisuke's actions, since he consistently shows more interest in Katsura. However, I think that could have been more emphasized. She claims she's doing it for Sekai, but it's presented so nonchalantly and hypocritically that it feels kind of like an afterthought in the overall narrative. Thus, with the exception of Hikari, I think the show actually does a fairly good job at giving each character motivations for liking Makoto, even in comparison to other harem series. Now, the show definitely is not without its faults. In my opinion, I thought Taisuke was a very boring and underdeveloped character. He obviously was supposed to be a darker take on the obnoxious best friend trope in visual novels, and while he did serve a purpose in the narrative, he just wasn't very interesting. Not to mention, while he was shown to be a tad persistent in the past, I think it's a bit of a stretch to say that he'd go that far after just one conversation with Otome. Also, I believe that the final 3 episodes were a tad too fast in comparison to the rest of the series, and I also wish that the characters had a bit more of a life outside their romance in the show. However, even with all of my issues, I found myself endlessly fascinated with School Days. The reasons I love it may even be the reasons a lot of people hate it. Some see it as a cautionary tale, some see it as a mean-spirited one, and both interpretations aren't necessarily wrong, but I see it first and foremost as a story that tested how I perceive people and their actions. Thanks for watching. If you liked this video, feel free to give it a like, as well as subscribe to see more content similar to this in the future. Press the bell so that you get notifications every time a video comes out. Twitter, my anime list, Discord, all in the description, check them all out. And with all of that in mind, I'll catch you later.